They told you Nelson Mandela was just a peaceful protester who magically ended apartheid through negotiations. They lied to you. Before he became the sanitized saint of reconciliation, Mandela was a revolutionary. A man who risked his life crossing borders in the dead of night, seeking weapons and military training to destroy the apartheid regime. Today, we're exposing one of the most dangerous missions of his life, a clandestine trip to Dakar, Senegal, that could have gotten him killed. This is the story they don't want you to know about the real Nelson Mandela. Picture this, it's the early 1960s. South Africa is a racial hell where black Africans are treated like animals in their own land. The white minority government has just banned the African National Congress. They've declared peaceful protest illegal. What did they expect? That millions of oppressed people would just quietly accept their enslavement forever? Mandela understood what Western liberals refuse to acknowledge even today, that when a regime uses violence to maintain power, the oppressed have every right to use violence to break free. The apartheid regime wasn't some genteel disagreement about policy. It was state-sponsored terrorism. They were murdering children in Soweto, torturing activists in prison, and stealing the land from its rightful owners, and when the world's governments did nothing, when Britain kept trading. When America kept investing, revolutionaries like Mandela had to seek help wherever they could find it, so Mandela went underground. He became the Black Pimpernel, a ghost moving through the shadows of Africa, building an army to overthrow white supremacy. But here's what makes me furious: while Western governments were collaborating with apartheid, providing weapons and intelligence to the regime, African nations were risking everything to support the liberation struggle. Countries like Senegal, under the leadership of President Leopold Sedar Senghor, were secretly harboring South African revolutionaries. They were providing safe houses, training camps, and weapons to freedom fighters. Think about the courage that took. These newly independent African nations, barely on their feet economically, were willing to face the wrath of Western powers to support their brothers and sisters in South Africa. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan was calling Mandela a terrorist and keeping him on the U.S. terror watch list until 2008. The hypocrisy is sickening. This brings us to that fateful trip to Dakar. According to the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Mandela stayed at the Hotel de La Paix during his clandestine visit to Senegal's capital. Can you imagine the tension? Here's a man who's already one of the most wanted fugitives in South Africa, traveling under false documents, knowing that apartheid agents are hunting him across the continent. The Hotel de La Paix, the Hotel of Peace, what bitter irony. Mandela wasn't there for peace. He was there for war. He was meeting with military advisors, learning about guerrilla tactics, securing weapons and explosives for the armed wing of the ANC. Every moment he spent in that hotel room, he was risking capture, torture, and execution. The apartheid regime had a long reach, and they'd already assassinated anti-apartheid activists across Africa, but Mandela knew what was at stake. He understood that the liberation of South Africa required more than just speeches and protests. It required fire and blood, and here's what makes this story so powerful. While Mandela was in Dakar seeking support for armed resistance, guess who was helping the apartheid regime? The United States was providing intelligence to South African security forces. Britain was selling them weapons. Israel was sharing military technology. The whole Western alliance was complicit in maintaining white supremacy in Africa. But African nations? They were putting their own security at risk to help their brothers fight for freedom. Senegal, Ghana, Tanzania, Algeria, these countries opened their doors to South African revolutionaries when the so-called free world turned its back. They provided training camps for MK, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. They understood something that Western liberals still refuse to accept, that oppressed people have the right to fight back by any means necessary. That when your children are being shot in the streets, when your people are being worked to death in mines, when your very existence is criminalized, you don't ask politely for change. You take it. This is the Mandela they don't want you to remember. Not the sanitized saint who forgave his oppressors, but the revolutionary who was willing to die for African liberation. In Dakar, he wasn't just seeking weapons, he was building networks of solidarity that would sustain the struggle for decades. He was learning from veterans of other liberation movements, studying the tactics that had freed Algeria from French colonialism. The man who sat in that hotel room in Dakar was the same man who later co-founded MK and authorized bombings of government installations. He was the same man who told the apartheid regime, "If you want to know about violence, look at what you've done to us." They want to erase this history because it's inconvenient. It doesn't fit their narrative of peaceful change and reconciliation. They want you to believe that oppressed people should always turn the other cheek, even when their oppressors are committing genocide, but Mandela knew better. He knew that sometimes the only language tyrants understand is force. Of course, Mandela paid the price for his courage. Within months of returning from trips like the one to Dakar, he was captured by South African security forces, with help from the CIA, according to multiple sources. 27 years in prison. 27 years stolen from his life because he dared to fight back against white supremacy, and even after his release, even after becoming president, he never forgot the countries that supported him in his darkest hour. He maintained close ties with Senegal and other African nations that had risked everything for the liberation struggle. Meanwhile, the Western powers that had propped up apartheid suddenly wanted to take credit for its downfall. They rewrote history to make themselves the heroes of a story where they were actually the villains. So what does this mean for us today? It means that when you see oppressed people fighting back, whether it's Palestinians resisting occupation, Africans fighting neo-colonialism, or any people struggling for their liberation, remember Mandela in Dakar. Remember that the same Western powers calling liberation movements terrorists today are the same ones that called Mandela a terrorist. The same ones that supported apartheid, supported colonialism, and continue to support oppression wherever it serves their interests. Real change has never come from asking nicely. It's come from people like Mandela who were willing to risk everything, their freedom, their lives, their futures, to break the chains of oppression. The next time someone tells you that oppressed people should only use peaceful methods, remind them of Mandela in Dakar. Remind them that freedom isn't given, it's taken. The Hotel de La Paix wasn't about peace. It was about preparing for war. And sometimes, war is the only path to justice. Never forget, they only call you a terrorist until you win. Then they call you a statesman. Mandela understood this. The question is, do you subscribe if you want more uncomfortable truths about the real history of liberation movements? Share this if you think people need to know the real Mandela, not the sanitized version they sell you. The struggle continues. The choice is yours.